Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. We're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. In addition to being an accomplished and widely experienced pilot, he is, in civilian life, a highly successful lawyer and litigator specializing in aviation law. Of most interest to today's subject, he has extensive experience flying SR-71 and agreed to share some of those fascinating experiences with us. The SR-71 Blackbird is, of course, the fastest and highest flying production aircraft ever built. Despite its age, it still holds numerous world records. To date, this exotic aircraft's accomplishments have never been matched. Ladies and gentlemen, Jack Veth.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you all for coming today. Welcome to the Museum of Flight. As Cindy said, my name is Jack Veth, and for about the next hour, we're going to talk about the SR-71. A few things before we get into that. I was going to introduce Maury and Jim Sheldon and Mark, but Cindy's already taken care of that. So I don't have to introduce them, but I can tell you that when I got to Beale Air Force Base, and I believe it was 1975, Jim Sheldon was the squadron commander. When I got my first look at the cockpit of the SR-71, Maury Rosenberg was the pilot that took me out there and told me what all those round dials were and what they did. So it's kind of like old home week here, and I appreciate their attendance, and I certainly appreciate your attendance. The other thing I was going to talk about first was what today's anniversary was, and I was going to ask you if you know what today's anniversary was. But I think that's been out of the bag. So you now know, July 20th, 50 years ago today, America put 2 men on the moon, that giant leap for mankind, if you will. And this is Buzz Aldrin. They spent, I think, about 20 hours on the moon. And the reason that today is important and the lunar landing is important is because when that happened in 50 years ago, that was around the same time as we developed the moon shot that the SR-71 was being developed and being used actively. It's a time in our country's history when we were developing a lot of airplanes, and aerospace was the place to be, if you will. And those of us in the room who were fortunate enough to be involved in it appreciate that time. Well, let's take a look at what we're going to do for the next hour. This is our flight plan. First thing we're going to do is take a look at the historical perspective of the SR-71, how it was developed, the Blackbird family. The SR-71 is just one airplane in the Blackbird family. There are actually 3 airplanes, and we'll get into those details, and I'll tell you how they developed in a couple of minutes. But then we'll look at the aircraft itself, the SR-71, some of the details of its construction, the limitations that it has, how Kelly Johnson, the individual who was responsible for designing and the Skunkworks, the place where the airplane was built, put the airplane together. Then we'll look at crew requirements. Individuals like those 3 of us in the room, 4 of us in the room who have had the opportunity to fly it. We're all volunteers, and what requirements we had and the training we went through, we'll talk about that. Then lastly, we'll look at the operation of the airplane. And I have a slide that'll show you the areas in the world where we operated out of, and additional slides to show you the types of missions that we flew out of the various areas where we operated. Well, before we do that, let me give you a little bit of history about me. My flight history, I went to pilot training in 1963. That's me kneeling in front of a T-38 just before graduation in pilot training at Williams Air Force Base. Following pilot training, I went to F-4s and had a tour in Vietnam. Came back from Vietnam, flew interceptors for Air Defense Command, the F-101, and then on to the SR-71. So those are the operational airplanes I flew. Here's a picture of me getting into an F-4C, and I appreciate having a third driver here as well. I can't tell you how much those of us who flew the F-4 appreciated those individuals who flew the 105 and the SAM missions that they went up against. Here's a crew picture. I just earlier signed, Larry was here, and he had a picture signed by the man on the left. The man on the left is Bill Keller. He was my backseater or reconnaissance systems operator, and Larry asked me to sign it, so now he has a picture signed by both of us. He got one from Rosenberg and McKim the last time he was here, so I think he's going to put mine on the left and yours on the right, or maybe mine a little. You're going to be on the top? Okay. That's the first question we asked. Where was it going to be? Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Blackbird program. Actually started conceptually back in 1959, and the SR-71 flew until about 1997. And before I tell you a little bit about the airplane, I want to ask you, does anybody know what this is? What these are? What are they? Slide rules. In fact, I think the one at the top is the Apple iSlide 1. The bottom one may be the Samsung version. But before we had computers, that's the way airplanes were designed. Engineers actually used those, and some of you in the audience, I'm sure, are engineers who used to use those things. Now everything is done on computer with CAD/CAM, but the SR-71 was designed and built thanks to this man, Kelly Johnson, who designed and built many airplanes, the F-104, T-33, but he's known mostly for the U-2, which is still flying today, and the SR-71. Going back to the beginning, coming out of World War II, the United States realized that there was going to be a tension, I'll use that word, tension, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And we felt the need for intelligence about what was going on in the Soviet Union in the 50s. In 1954, the CIA contracted with Lockheed to design and build the U-2 aircraft so they could find out more about what was going on in the Soviet Union with respect to bombers and missiles. You remember terms of the bomber gap and the missile gap. Those terms led through the end of the 50s and into the 60s. The goal was to be at 70,000 feet, but the U-2, as you know, does not fly supersonic. The first flight of the U-2 was in 1956, and in October of 57, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which started the space race. That's the tie-in between the SR and the moon landing, because that was the ultimate of the space race. The program was codenamed Archangel. The U-2 program had been called Angel. Kelly gave the Blackbird program the name Archangel as a carry-on. And the goal was to be at 90,000 feet and above Mach 3, if possible. In August of '59, CIA gave the go-ahead for the A-12. In the Archangel program, there were 12 variants that Kelly had designed. The A-12 was the one that they chose to pursue. May 1st, the U-2 was shot down. You may remember Gary Powers and the trial of Gary Powers, an embarrassment to the United States. But in April of '62, the initial A-12 test occurred. That was, in fact, the first Blackbird. August of '63, the first YF-12, a variant of the A-12, but the interceptor version for Air Defense Command, flew. And then in December of '64, the first SR-71. So those are the three aircraft that were in the Blackbird program. The interceptor version was never pursued. Numerous problems occurred keeping the airplane. One of the requirements for Air Defense Command is to have 5-minute launch capability. And with the SR-71 Blackbird type aircraft, you never got launch capability within 5 minutes to maintain alert. So, in May of '67, the A-12 deployed to Kadena, and its mission there was to fly over Vietnam, which it did. And in May of '68, the first SR-71 mission out of Kadena occurred as well. So, for a while, there were two variants flying missions out of Kadena. The first SR-71 mission out of Kadena was in '89. And the final SR-71 mission out of Kadena was in October of 1989. In March of 1990, the final SR-71 flight from Palmdale to the East Coast occurred, and that was about 1 hour and 5 minutes. That airplane now sits in the Udvar Hazy Museum on Dulles Field. In 1995, the SR-71 was reactivated. 2 aircraft were reactivated in Edwards Air Force Base, and within 2 years they were deactivated. The aircraft never flew again. At one point, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force asked Kelly Johnson what would it cost to destroy all of the airplanes that existed, all of the SR-71s that existed. and Kelly gave him a figure of $86 million a piece. Clearly, Kelly didn't want to destroy the airplanes. But the chief of staff said, well, if it's going to cost that much, why don't we just send them off to museums? And that's where they are. Most of them are all in museums. There's one in Los Angeles, that's an A-12. There's one down in San Diego, that's an A-12. The SR-71 sits in pristine condition at the March Air Force Base. If you haven't been there before, you should go out and see that airplane. And Jim Shelton works very closely with the people at March to maintain that display. So in summary, the goal was Mach 3, 90,000 feet with a low radar return. What was achieved was Mach 3.3, 90,000 feet with a 1 square meter return, which is very small. The Archangel program developed 2 operational airplanes, the A-12, which was under the code name Oxcart. When you go back to your computers and you want to get on the internet, just plug in the word Oxcart and see what comes up. You'll find that interesting if you're interested in that program. 13 airplanes were built. 5 were lost. With the SR-71, that was under the program name Senior Crown. For the SR-71, there were 32 airplanes built and 12 of them lost through the length of the program. So now let's transition to some facts about the SR-71 itself. The aircraft flies at Mach 3, as I mentioned. So what is Mach 3? Well, it varies with temperature, therefore it varies with altitude as far as the Mach number goes, but Mach 1 would be approximately 1,000 feet per second. You could extrapolate that out, and Mach 3.2 would be about 32 to 33 miles per minute. So if you were here, or let's say you want to fly from Orange County to Los Angeles, it's about 60 miles, you could do that in 2 minutes in the SR-71. Now, you're not going to do it from a standing stop. You've got to be at speed and altitude before you get there. It flies between 14 and 16 miles in the air, and from that altitude, you can see the curvature of the Earth, which is fascinating to see, and I do have a picture of that I'll show you. The aircraft flies faster than the rotation of the Earth. So what that means is if you're heading west at around sunset, you can head into the sunset after it's set, and the sun will rise in the west, which I have to tell you is a spectacular sight. I saw that a few times when I was flying. The first time I saw it, I remember telling Bill Kellett, my RSO, I said, Bill, you're not going to believe what I'm looking at up here. He thought there was something wrong with the airplane. He said, what's wrong? And I said, well, I'm seeing the sun rise in the west. Spectacular sight. As far as design, graphite over asbestos over titanium. Because of the speed and the temperatures that the aircraft heats up to, aluminum was not a sufficient material to build the aircraft out of. So Kelly chose to use titanium, and the black squares and triangles that you see around the aircraft on the slide are actually there to assist in the stealth characteristics of the aircraft. People always ask about the black paint. Why is the airplane painted black? I'll give you the answer to that right now, so you won't have to ask me later. 2 reasons. First, there's material in the paint which again helps the stealth characteristics of the airplane dissipate the radar energy, and also it helps for the heat exhaustion. It'll dissipate the heat and move it around, keep the airplane a little cooler. The airplane still gets very hot, as you can see from this slide, with temperatures anywhere between 400 all the way up to 1,200 degrees. It's been said that because of the heat, the aircraft will expand. It'll expand between 2 to 3 inches in length and also about 1 to 2 inches in width. I can tell you, when I was in the cockpit, I never had any more room. So I don't know where these figures come from or who is standing there measuring the airplane when it's at that temperature. But I guess some engineer figured out that's what was going on. But I looked around and it never got any bigger in the cockpit. Speaking of the cockpit, for those of you who flew airplanes in the 50s and 60s, that should look very familiar to you. If you look at today's aircraft, they have glass cockpits and all computerized. But the SR-71 cockpit was basic round dials. And you can see some of the specific instrumentation, the ADI for attitude reference right in the center. 2 boxes below that round black and white oval is the map display. And that map display allowed the pilot to know where on the Earth they were flying over. And there was a black line on the map, and you were supposed to stay on the black line as you were doing your reconnaissance run. Engine instruments, standard. What was added to the cockpit after we started flying at night was a white line across the center of the cockpit to give a peripheral view balance, because as you'll see in some pictures, flying at night in the SR-71 is like flying in an inkwell. It's very black, very dark, and there aren't many references. You're out at the end of this 105 6-inch aircraft, and there's no references to ground the pilot, if you will. In addition to the cockpit, here's a picture of the ANS, the Astro-Inertial Nav System, a product produced by Northrop that allows the crew to keep the aircraft within less than 300 feet of any point on the Earth. This system is still being used today in the Northrop B-2 bomber. And some interesting facts about this system: no GPS, everything is internal. So the Astro-Inertial Nav System, once you pulled out of the hangar, would triangulate the aircraft's position using 3 stars. So it's scanning this sky, picks out the 3 stars that it's looking for, knows its exact position because of the location of those stars, and then can tell the aircraft and the crew where it is from that point forward. Compare that to some of the aircraft we have today, even combat airplanes, who use GPS and are relying on satellites to tell them where they are. In wartime situation, do you really think those satellites are going to be there? If they're not, how does the crew find out where it is or where it's going? With the SR-71, we didn't need anything from outside to tell us where we were, and if we could update the computer location and then update where we wanted to go, the computer would take us there. And Mark is the one who kept that going. So if you have any questions about the ANS system, Mark will, if he has a good memory, he can tell you about it. Okay, let's go take a look at the engines and the start. The fuel on this aircraft is JP7, and you may have heard stories that as the aircraft sits in the hangar, it leaks a lot of fuel. I've seen a couple of the ground crew get the attention of people who are looking at the aircraft. They'll pull out a match, light the match, and throw a match into the fuel. Not something I would recommend, but I've seen them do it, and the fuel extinguishes the match, as opposed to the other way around. And the reason for that is because of the flash point of JP7 is so high, it takes a catalytic ignition, another component to ignite the JP7. And that component is TEB, which is triethylborane. Triethylborane is an element that if we had a little bit of it here, and once we exposed it to oxygen, it would explode. It would light up. So spontaneous ignition once exposed to oxygen, and that's what would light off the JP7. What you see in this slide is the protective clothing on the ground crew individual who is placing the TEB into the engine. So each engine had a TEB container, if you will, held the TEB, and we would use a shot of TEB every time we started the engine, every time we ignited the afterburners. And basically you had 16 shots of TEB in each engine, so you could use the TEB to ignite the afterburner if you had a climb to altitude and then a descent to refuel, and then ignite the afterburner again, back up to altitude. That would be how the TEB was used. The engine is the key to the capabilities of the aircraft. If you look at the aircraft, what looks like the engine, which is the 2 long tubes on either side, one on either side, break that long tube into 3 sections. The first section would be the inlet, the middle section is the engine, and the third section is the afterburner. The engine portion is a J58, a very powerful engine, and what's unique about this engine is that it can go for 2 hours in afterburner. I don't know of any other aircraft engine or aircraft that has that capability. Most fighter airplanes, you engage the afterburner, you're burning up a lot more fuel, and as you burn down the fuel, then you have to dash to get to a high speed, then you pull it out of afterburner. The SR-71 can cruise at high speed, and in fact, the higher the speed, the more economical the aircraft becomes. So if you want to save fuel, you go faster. Here's the inlet. The inlet moves back and forth to maintain the shock wave. Again, some engineers may be able to tell you, but the compressor blades in the engines cannot swallow air that's going faster than Mach 1. It has to be subsonic air. So that when you're going Mach 3, the initial air going into the inlet is also Mach 3. Somewhere that air has to slow down and get below Mach 1 in order to get into the engine. And that's what the spike does. The spike moves back and forth to maintain the shock wave from the high-speed air going to low-speed air so it can be used by the engine. All right, what Jim pointed out is that the top picture is what the engine looks like at speed after it's been cooking, if you will, as you're going Mach 3. And what you wanted to point out was the red glow. The bottom picture is what they call the 13 joules, where if the engine is operating properly, again, this is on a test stand down in Florida, or it may have been up at Beale, but you can see the individual joules, as you will. Okay, back to the inlet. That spike moves in and out for a total of about 26 inches, and it maintains the shock wave in front of the compressor blade so that the air going into the engine is subsonic. The rest of the air is bled over the top. At speed and altitude, 80% of the thrust on this aircraft comes from the inlet as opposed to from the engine, only 20% from the engine. Okay, the airplane also has defensive systems so that we can tell if we're being tracked by ground radar, and we can also tell if there's been a launch of any kind of a SAM against the airplane. And from the research I did preparing for this, I discovered that over the years, particularly in Vietnam, there were about 1,000 missiles fired at the aircraft, and only one, Denny Sullivan, was flying, and there was a little speck of the SAM that they found in the bottom of the aircraft after the aircraft landed. Otherwise, the airplane is untouched. There was missiles flying out of Korea as well, and Maury was flying the airplane at that time. So if you have any questions about what it looks like to have a SAM come up to you, ask Mr. Rosenberg. I can tell you what they look like from an F4, and a 105 pilot can certainly tell you what they look like, but when you're at 85,000 feet, Maury will have to tell you that one. Okay, one of the weakest points, if you will, of any airplane that can get this hot is the tires. And these tires are specially designed. They're filled with nitrogen. The cost on these tires, if they were to be purchased today, is approximately $18,000 a piece. The airplane had 8 of them, 6 on the main and 2 in the front, for a total of 8. And you got about 15 landings out of each tire. Okay, we didn't go anywhere, with the exception of 1 or 2 missions, without tankers. And the aircraft had what were called Q tankers, specially designed tankers flying out of Beale that would fly worldwide. They'd pre-launch and go to areas around the world to support our program, because without the tankers, the airplane is basically limited to about 2,200 miles and about 2 hours of flight. After that time, you're looking to either land or refuel. Okay, let's transition to some facts about the crews. First of all, in the application process, everybody who flew the airplane were volunteers. And when it came to pilots, they were looking for approximately 2,000 hours of flying time and about 5 to 7 years of flying practice. If you go back and look at my background, I had close to 3,000, and I had been flying for about 6 years when I applied. Multiple aircraft was also required, and it would be good if at least one of them was a high-performance airplane and that you had refueling experience. You had to submit an application. The application was reviewed. We would get somewhere around 800 to 900 applications a year, and then people were selected to come to Beale for a week long interview process. During that interview process, you spent 2 days at Travis Air Force Base going through basically a very complete physical. It was similar to the astronaut physical. Following that, you were interviewed by wing personnel. You got a T-38 flight with other SR-71 pilots, and you got a time in a simulator. So picture this, you're maybe an F-4 pilot or T-38 pilot, you apply, you come out to Beale, and they put you in an SR-71 simulator and throw emergency procedures at you. That'll wake you up in the morning. What they're looking at is what your basic aviation capability is and how you react in emergency situations. After the simulator flight, I put it the last one there, spend time with the crew members. We used to call this bar. And what was happening at bar is the crew members were basically evaluating whether they want to hang around with you, because we spent anywhere from 200 to 260 days a year away from Beale, deployed to locations in Asia and in Europe. During that time, we spent our time with the other crew members. And during bar, the crew members decided whether they wanted to spend that time with you. Here's kind of a summary. You can see that one day that they suited up all these crew members just to take a picture in front of the airplane, which is kind of a good looking picture and summarizes the requirements. But once you've been selected, you spend the next year in one of these boxes. If you were selected as a pilot, you spend your time in the box on the left. If you were an RSO, you spend your time in the one on the right. In this simulator, you would learn procedures. You'd learn emergency procedures, you'd learn normal procedures, and you'd basically familiarize yourself with the help of the instructor, who would throw emergency procedures at you to see how you handled them before you actually got in the airplane. Once it was time to get in the airplane, you flew in the B model. Now take a look at this picture closely. You'll notice back from the front cockpit, there's a bubble. That bubble is where the instructor could fly the airplane and could see outside. So the B model was never used for operational missions, it was only used for training. And you spend time in this aircraft learning how to handle the aircraft subsonically, learning how to refuel the aircraft and getting practice at refueling and landings and takeoffs, and also going at speed. After you've had 5 flights in the B model, you got to do your first A model flight, and that would be in an aircraft without the bubble and with an experienced RSO in the back. You want an experienced RSO so that if anything were to go wrong, the RSO could help the pilot out and get the airplane back on the ground. Fly with an experienced RSO, do, again, training, and you're still in this first year, you haven't done anything operationally yet, and you haven't even flown with your own crew. After you flew with the RSO, the experienced RSO, then you get to fly with your own crew member, and the two of you would fly from that point forward, gaining hours, gaining experience, flying at night, refueling, practicing, so that you could fly on your first operational tour. In your first operational tour, you had to have 100 hours in the airplane before you went overseas. 200 hours minimum in the simulator, and then you could deploy to a forward location. That location was normally Okinawa in Japan. And then you're ready for flight. Here's 2 intrepid airmen getting ready to get in the airplane. But where most airplanes, you just jump in and strap yourself in the SR-71, it's a little special. It takes a group of people to get you into that airplane. And here's a picture of a pilot being strapped in with a Physiological Support Division individual on the left, and on the right, helping to strap the pilot into the aircraft. And the same thing is going on in the back seat for the RSO. Okay, let's take a look at some of the patches that the crew members would wear. On the spacesuit, you'd wear on your left shoulder this small emblem of the American flag plus your name. Once you flew operational missions over in Okinawa, you could get the Habu patch. The Habu patch can only be worn by crew members who have flown operational missions. The other patch is the Mach 3 patch. Anybody associated with the program can get a Mach 3 patch and wear it on their uniform. And last, we can look at the squadron patch. This was the first SRS, Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron patch that goes all the way back to the beginning of flight in the military. I promised you a picture of what the Earth looks like from 80,000 feet, and you can see the curvature of the Earth in this picture. I have another picture of what the Earth looks like at night from 80,000 feet. And as somebody told me once, you haven't been lost until you've been lost at night at Mach 3. And I can tell you that that is true. I flew the first post-Vietnam night flight out of Kadena over Korea, and they set it up for what we call a two-loop mission. We took off, hit a tanker, flew through the DMZ, came back across the DMZ, then descended down to refuel with a tanker, and then go back and do it again. The problem was we used the same basic flight that we had used during the daytime, which included, after the first Mach 3 run, a 90-degree descending turn at night into the tanker. By the time we finished that 90-degree descending turn, descending from 85,000 feet down to 26,000 feet, my head was telling me that I was doing loops in that aircraft. And I knew that wasn't true because I could see the instruments. But as those of you who are pilots know, you get a different impression from your little hairs in your ear. And I kept talking to my backseater, who also has an attitude indicator, and I said, Bill, are we doing a loop? No, we're straight and level. Okay. 10 seconds later, Bill, are we in a loop? No, we're straight and level. And particularly when we were on a tanker, I was still discombobulated, if you will, while we were refueling. But we managed to get the fuel, we managed to do the second loop. We came back and landed, and during the debrief, I told the mission planners, I said, guys, you're gonna have to change that mission. We're gonna lose an airplane if we keep flying that way, because it's not safe. Another pilot, one of the standboard pilots, a guy with a lot of experience, flew the same mission the next week. He came down and said the same thing, and they changed the flights from that point on to straight in one-loop flights as opposed to two-loop flights with a second tanker. And they also incorporated that peripheral light bar in the cockpit that was developed for the same purpose. Operations, what was the purpose of the aircraft? Well, for strategic reconnaissance, obviously, to find out what was going on behind the Iron Curtain, if you would. Stimulate the environment. The national command authorities would use the aircraft to, if you will, excite the radar systems of Russia. And we had other airplanes in the air that would be able to tell which radars were coming on at what time, so we could check the recovery time and the response time for their defensive systems, and also to support operations. Here is where we operated. The blue dots are the locations that we flew out of. Basically, our home base was Beale Air Force Base in Northern California. Okinawa was Det 1, and then Mildenhall in England was Det 4. There were also a couple of flights out of Diego Garcia, and that's that blue square that you see. The red dots are where we flew the missions, and I have individual slides to show you where they are. But we are honored today to have Jim with us because Jim Shelton has the honor of having flown the longest operational mission in the SR-71. I believe that's about 11 and a half hours? 11:20. But who's counting, right? 11:20. And he can tell you the whole story of that, but basically it was out of Griffiths. It was flown into the area of the Arab-Israeli war. The command authorities in the United States wanted confirmation of how far into Egypt the Israeli forces had gone, and it was Jim's job to go out and make a loop through the area, take some pictures, take some radar, and come back and let our command authorities know what was going on the ground. And because of various political reasons, the flight, which could have been shorter had he been able to land someplace else, he had to fly all the way back to Griffiths Air Force Base in New York in order to land. During the Vietnam War, coming out of Okinawa, the airplane flew many times over North Vietnam. In fact, during one flight, we had two SR-71s up to fly over North Vietnam. 15 seconds apart to let the prisoners know. Pardon me? Oh, there were 3 who flew? Oh, okay. Oh, they crossed over North Vietnam to let the prisoners that were in Sante, the Hanoi Hilton, know that they were going to try to extract them. That didn't work, but they did hear the sound because wherever the airplane went, the sonic boom trailed behind it. Out of Okinawa, we also flew over Korea. Most of our missions were over Korea, then the lower right, the lower left. And then we also flew up around Vladivostok and into the Sea of Okhotsk, which is in the eastern side of Russia. Flying into the Warsaw Pact areas, into the Baltic, you can see the speed at 2.8. The reason for the 2.8 as opposed to 3.0 is because of the turn. The area in there gets kind of tight, and at 60,000 feet, you can hold at 2.8. Here you're looking for troop rotations, personnel movements, any activity that's on the ground. Looking for sub-pens, submarine activity, into the northern part of Russia. You can come in, again, out of Mildenhall, make your Mach 3 run aiming right at Russia, and then make a hard turn out to get out of there. The Russians didn't particularly appreciate this flight plan and would send up some of their interceptors to attempt to intercept the SR-71. They were never successful in doing that. We also flew in Libya to do bomb assessment in 1986 after President Reagan had ordered some bombings in Tripoli. And we also flew in Cuba and Nicaragua. In Cuba, it was to make sure that the Russians were not setting up any missile bases again. The last picture of the fleet before it was dispersed shows you all the aircraft lined up at Beale. Okay, now it's time for questions. And as I said, with all the SR-71 experience in here, if I can't answer a question for one reason or another, I'm sure Jim or Maury or Mark will be able to do it. The question is, does the RSO have flight controls? The answer is no. In the A model, the only flight controls are in the front. In the B model, which has the second cockpit, is designed for an instructor. The RSO doesn't sit there. The instructor, who's also a pilot, sits there, and there are controls in the B model, but none in the A model. Okay, the question was, did I ever experience an inlet unstart event? First, I'll have to explain what an inlet unstart is. As I mentioned, that spike retracts as you increase speed, a total of 26 inches. Once you're at speed, the spike is fully retracted. At times, because of turbulence in the air or something with the engine, the air disturbance in the spike area will cause the supersonic air to be pushed out, so that the spike drives forward as it reacquires the shock wave and then moves back. It's an attempt to self-adjust for the inlet. The problem is, once that spike moves forward, now you have tremendous drag on that side of the aircraft. The aircraft will then yaw, and your head will hit the other side of the canopy. So if it's the left side, your head will hit the left side, or the right side. And yes, I did experience, and the ones I experienced were not very violent. They were relatively mild. I never experienced that many of them because I believe if you watch the door indicators in the cockpit, you can almost predict when there's going to be an unstart. But it has been known to be very violent, and I have heard, I've never seen, but I've heard pilots having their helmet cracked once it bounced off the side. And I'm sure that Maury and Jim also experienced inlet unstarts. They can tell you about that too later. The question was, is there a way to escape from the airplane if you have to abandon it? You're speaking on the ground or in flight. In flight, there's an ejection seat, and people have safely ejected out of this aircraft. You could initiate the ejection seat either by handles on the side, or there was another handle in the center. Where you pull that and the canopy would go, and then the seat would eject. At altitude, you would stay in the seat. The crew member would stay in the seat as you came down, and then at about 20,000 feet or so, you would separate from the seat, and a parachute would come out, the one that you were carrying with you. The question, as worded, was we're basically a camera platform, and what kind of cameras, and did we scrubber if it was bad weather? Well, we were more than a camera platform, because we also had radar. And that's one of the things that the A-12 didn't have, but the SR-71 did. So we had cameras along the side in the chine bays, and we could have a huge camera in the front, but they could swap out the nose so they could put radar in the nose, and then it didn't make any difference whether it was night or bad weather. The radar could still take radar images of whatever the area was that the command authorities were interested in. So we didn't have to scrub a mission because of weather. The question is, with respect to the spike and door control, because they work together, were there indicators and did we control them? Yes, there were indicators of both the left and right spike and the left and right doors, but they were all operated by computer, and we didn't have to get involved with their work, in other words, manually operate them, unless there was a malfunction. So we would practice using the controls for the spike and doors manually, but in most flights we did not use them manually. We let the computer do its thing. What the gentleman said was, as Mr. Boone was coming down in the parachute, he was thinking, what am I going to tell the boss? They had various cover stories as the airplane was being developed. When the A-12, there's a story of, let's see, when the first A-12 came apart in the air, and again, that was over in Nevada, a farmer came out and picked up the pilot and was going to drive the pilot to where the airplane had hit the ground and smoke was coming up. And the pilot said, oh, I wouldn't do that. That was an F-105 and it had a nuclear bomb on board, so you might want to go someplace else, because he didn't want a farmer to go over and see the airplane. So once he got to the hospital and made the call, then the appropriate parties went to the aircraft. The question is, can we talk about the drone? I don't have any experience with the drone. It was the M21 drone. The concept was that the drone, which was a Mach 3 drone, would sit on top of the SR-71, and the airplane that handled that is on display up in Seattle. But as you're going Mach 3, the pilot would hit a button and this drone would take off and fly over the area to take pictures, because you could get into the Soviet Union with unmanned aircraft, but Eisenhower had promised the Russians that we wouldn't send manned aircraft over there. The problem was, third flight, I think it was, the drone pitched to the left, took out the airplane, took out the SR-71, and Kelly Johnson canceled the flight. There's still 15 drones that are in storage, I think in Palmdale, but they never were used operationally. The question was, do I know where the astroinertial system was built? It was designed and built by Northrop, so I assume it was down here in Southern California. Okay, so the building where the astroinertial nav system was built, you can see from here, it may still be built there because they're still using them. The B-2 is using it. Okay, the question is, if you lose one engine, well, you're not going to continue the mission. That's the first step. At that point, if you lose an engine, you're in an emergency situation and you're going to land at the closest airport, at the airfield that you can. And the airplane responds very well on one engine, despite the fact that the engines are not center-lined. And we do practice during the training program, and then subsequently you practice one engine approaches so that you know what the handling characteristics are. But the airplane responds very well under one engine. Question is, are there any operational 71s today? No. they were all canceled and sent to museums. The question was on the light that I mentioned. Yes, it was installed, I believe, over the right shoulder, if I remember correctly, and it projected a horizon, and it was connected to gyros to maintain the horizon, just like the attitude indicator. The question was, did I ever have to recover other than an operational base? And the answer is no, not me personally. I was involved in the recovery of aircraft that did have to recover at non-operational bases. Did you ever land away? Where? Was that on a Cuba mission? Okay, so Maury just told that he was on a Cuba mission, one of the missions I showed you, and something happened with the airplane and he had to land, and he landed at MacDill Air Force Base. And that's a very interesting thing. What happens when the SR-71 lands away, the crew, the ground crew and personnel at Deal have to gin up a couple of airplanes and fly in a KC-135 to MacDill, bring start equipment, bring fuel equipment, bring all the things necessary to get the airplane back flying again so they can get it home and fix it. Okay, the question is, with the SR-71, the aircraft that were lost, what caused that? Interestingly, while people expected losses to be at Mach, at supersonic speed, I think there was only one that was lost at supersonic speed. The others were all lost at lower speeds for various reasons. The question was, how many missions and hours do I have in the SR-71? I don't remember how many missions I have, but I have a little over, probably about 350 hours. Maury's got over 600, don't you? You have over 1,000? Okay, so he's high time. And Jim, 911? Okay. Mark, how many do you have? No? You? Mark doesn't remember. He flew the airplane? The question is, being a pilot, he noticed a G meter, and he wanted to know about capability of turns. At speed and altitude, 45 degrees was considered a high speed, a high bank turn. Most turns were less than that, so usually about 30 degrees at speed. Now, down subsonic, you could go up to 60 degrees a bank. You could go further, but it wasn't recommended. You're not going to do a roll in this airplane, and you're not going to put a lot of Gs. So 60 degrees a bank, 2G turn for a pitch out, for a landing, that's not a problem. But anything steeper than that, you're not going to do that at altitude either. Wow. The question was, what was my most memorable flight? I would have to say the flight that I flew from California to Okinawa. We would swap out airplanes the airplanes would have to go through various tests and modifications, so the airplanes that were overseas would have to be flown back, and we would have to fly new airplanes over. And I had the experience to fly an airplane from Deal to Okinawa, along the coast of Alaska, along the coast of Russia, the Kamchatka Peninsula, down into the Korean Peninsula, and then into Okinawa. That took about 6.5 hours. So I'd say that was probably one I can think of memory. Basically, any flight in that airplane is a memorable flight. It was a joy to fly, and I can speak for the 3 pilots in the room. I bet every one of us wish we were still doing it. And they're nodding their head. Okay, the question is there a lot to do while you're flying, I presume? Yes, there's a lot to do. For both the reconnaissance systems operator in the back and the pilot is basically monitoring the systems that make the airplane fly. And one of the basic things that I considered myself was a fuel manager, because you would go through fuel rather rapidly, and you could also move fuel. There was a switch to transfer fuel from one tank to the other. And by transferring fuel, you could adjust the angle of attack of the aircraft. If you could adjust the angle of attack, you could therefore adjust the amount of fuel that was being used, because you could become more economical or less economical. So by fine-tuning the airplane and getting the most out of the fuel, to me, was my primary job. But in addition to that, you had to watch the inlets and make sure they were operating properly, because I also felt that this was one of the most honest airplanes I'd ever flown. In other words, before something happened, I always got some indication. So if I was closely monitoring the instruments, I could almost predict what was going to happen in the aircraft once you learned the airplane and flew it for a while and became very familiar with it. So there's a lot to do. Most of us would lose anywhere from, because you're in the suit as well, so most of us would lose between 3 and 8 pounds on an average flight. And I'm sure on Jim's 11-hour and 20-minute flight, he probably lost about 20 pounds. Wow, okay, the question was, what's the max speed that you can eject? There wasn't a limitation. There's no limitation, either high or low. The question is there a limitation after you land on getting out of the aircraft? Not that I'm aware of. I never, you touch down, you pull the drag chute, you taxi off the runway, you taxi into the hangars, you shut down the airplane, open the canopy, and you get out. No limitation that I'm aware of. The question was, what's the turning radius? And my answer was, at speed and altitude, it's anywhere between 150 and 170 miles. So you're basically crossing state lines if you're flying over the United States. All the backseaters were military pilots in the SR-71, and a typical background, what experience they had, they were navigators. Most of them came out of B-52s, I would imagine, right? Some of them came out of the FB-111 as well. The question was, what was the reason for the reactivation? The program was reactivated by Congress, not by the military. And from the reading that I have done, there were members of Congress who thought the airplane should be reactivated because satellites at that point were not as reliable, and they were also predictable. So when the satellite is taking reconnaissance photos or whatever pictures they're taking from a satellite, you know when the satellite is coming around. One of the advantages of the SR-71 is you could be anywhere in a short period of time unannounced. They didn't know where we were. So there were people in Congress who thought that we should reactivate the program and use the aircraft. They budgeted, I think, $100 million to reactivate the program and had 2 airplanes flying out of Edwards. They selected the crews, checked out in the airplane, and then never used them. And after 2 years, President Clinton canceled the program. The question was that you understand that Robert McNamara ordered the destruction of the tooling, and the question was, do I know why? It was not unusual for military aircraft to have the tooling destroyed. That was also done at Northrop, when Northrop came out with the first flying wing before the B-2. The jigs that made that airplane were also destroyed. As to why the order was given for the SR-71, I don't know why, but I can confirm that they were destroyed. And I don't know if it was Robert McNamara who ordered it destroyed or whether there was somebody from the Air Force who ordered it destroyed. So I don't have the answer to that. Well, I think that's all time we have for questions. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.